There is a particular light that comes through the front window of my house in Brenham, Texas, every November morning. Warren used to stand in it when he was drinking his first cup of coffee. Just stand there, not saying anything, watching the yard. He did that for 46 years. I think about that light every time I walk past that window now. I was thinking about it. The Tuesday morning I found my daughter-in-law standing in my living room with a yellow legal pad, measuring my walls. She hadn't heard me come out of the bedroom. Her heels clicked slowly on the hardwood as she moved from window to window, writing something down after each one. Not asking, not explaining. Just documenting my house. The house where I raised 2 children, the house where Warren stood in that morning light, as though it were already something other than mine. And here is what stopped me cold. The notepad wasn't blank. She was already on the second page. This had been going on longer than I knew. My name is Margaret Elaine Coover. I'm 72 years old. I'm not dramatic. I don't raise my voice. I don't make scenes. But I have never once in my life been someone who disappears simply because it would be easier for everyone else if I did. Before I get into this, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city and state in the comments. I read everyone, and it means more than you know. Now, let me tell you what really happened. Warren passed 4 years ago, the week before Thanksgiving. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't apologize. We'd had 46 years together, and I won't pretend they were all easy, because Warren would laugh at me from wherever he is if I said that. But they were ours, fully, stubbornly, gratefully ours. After he passed, my son Elliot stepped in. Elliot is 51, lives in Houston, works in commercial real estate. He's a man who has spent his entire career deciding what to do with other people's property. And somewhere along the way, without either of us noticing, he began applying that same instinct to me. I let him at first. Grief makes you want to hand things off. It is genuinely easier to let someone organized take the wheel when you can barely get through a Tuesday. So I let him handle the paperwork. I let him review the accounts when he sat across from me at the kitchen table that first January and said, "Mom, you don't need to worry about any of this." I believed it was kindness. Looking back, that was not actually the first warning. The first warning, it came even earlier, and I almost missed it entirely. 2 months after the funeral, I started receiving mail from a Houston property management company, letters addressed to Elliot, forwarded through my address, that I had never been told a thing about. By the time a second envelope arrived, with my address printed clean on the label, I understood it wasn't a mistake. I called Elliot. He said it was nothing, just something he'd been exploring on my behalf, and he'd get them to stop. He was warm. He was smooth. And I, 4 months into widowhood and not yet trusting my own instincts, decided to let it go. What I didn't know then was that my friend Dolores had already had a conversation with Elliot that I was never supposed to hear about. Dolores and I have been friends since our daughters were in Girl Scouts together, which tells you exactly how long that is. She called me one afternoon in the spring. I was in the kitchen pulling dead leaves off my begonias. And she said, "Margaret, I ran into Elliot at the hardware store. He mentioned you might be considering putting the house on the market." He said that. Not in so many words. He said you were thinking about your options. I was not thinking about any options. No one had asked me about any options. I called Elliot that evening. He said Dolores must have misheard. General conversation, nothing serious. Of course, any decision about the house was entirely mine. He was smooth about it. He has always been smooth. After I hung up, I stood at the sink a long time, running water over a dish I'd already washed clean. Just standing there until the water ran cold. That's what you learn to do at 72. You keep careful files, not because you plan to use them right away, but because you understand that one day you might need to. Elliot's wife is named Patrice. She's 48, sharp as a letter opener, and has never once in 14 years of marriage called me anything other than Margaret, which is my name and perfectly correct, but which still manages to sound, when she says it, like a polite distance being maintained. After Warren passed, Patrice began calling more frequently. Checking in, she called it. What I noticed over time was that the calls felt less like connection and more like inventory. She was always circling the house, the roof, the taxes, the upstairs bathroom. Reasonable questions on the surface. But I could hear a pen at her end, I started giving shorter answers. I didn't understand what she was building toward until October, and by then it was already further along than I'd imagined. I had a hip procedure that fall, minor outpatient, but enough that Elliot and Patrice offered to come stay for a week while I recovered. I said yes. What I didn't know was that they came prepared in ways that went well beyond cooking and driving me to appointments. On the third evening, I came downstairs for water and found Elliot at my kitchen table with his laptop open, looking at something. When he heard me on the stairs, he closed it. Not dramatically, just quietly, naturally, the way you close something you weren't expecting to share. I said nothing. I got my water. I went back to bed. On the fourth morning, I woke early and came down the hall, and I saw her before she saw me. Patrice, in the early grey light, moving along my living room wall, measuring each window with her hand, completely at ease. The ease of a person moving through a space she has already in her mind decided the future of. I stood in the doorway and I did not announce myself. I just watched. The pen scratched on the pad, her heels clicked, and I thought, this is not the first morning she has done this. When she finally turned and saw me, she recovered quickly. Put the notepad face down on the coffee table. Morning, Margaret. Coffee's on. Thank you, I said. I walked to the kitchen. I poured my coffee. I stood at the window and looked out at Warren's garden. The raised beds he'd built with his own hands in 2009. The rose arbor he'd never quite gotten level. And I thought, very quietly, without drama, I have been patient for 4 years. I have been so careful not to be a burden, so careful not to ask too many questions. And this is what that patience bought me. A daughter-in-law measuring my windows at 6 a.m. while I slept. Some things you can feel yourself deciding, even before the words form. That was one of them. I have a younger sister named Ruth. She lives in Fredericksburg, about an hour from me. Ruth is 68, retired from the school district, and has always been the kind of woman who sees around corners that other people walk straight into. I called her the afternoon Elliot and Patrice drove back to Houston. They're planning something, I said. Ruth didn't ask me to explain. That's the thing about a sister who has known you your whole life. You don't have to describe the shape of a worry. She already knows. How far along do you think they are? She asked. Further than I'd like, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, have you talked to Franklin? Franklin Greer has been my attorney since 1998. He is 74 years old, plays golf badly and knows it, and handles legal matters with the same unhurried patience he's had since the day I first walked into his office 25 years ago. Warren trusted him completely. So do I. I had not called him in 2 years. I called him the next morning. I explained what I'd seen. The laptop, the legal pad, the property management letters. He listened without interrupting. Come in Thursday, he said. Bring whatever documents you have, the deed, the will, anything financial. Let's see where you actually stand before we decide anything. I brought everything. Warren's grey binder with the color-coded tabs, insurance, property, accounts, that he'd kept so meticulously it sometimes made me ache to look at it because it was so entirely him. Franklin sat across from me and read for a long time without saying a word. Then he looked up. Your will names Elliot as sole executor, he said. That's standard. But your property documents... He paused, tapping one page with his finger. These give him fairly broad authority to act on your behalf in certain situations. Did you understand that when you signed? I had not understood that, not fully. Franklin leaned back in his chair and said something I've thought about nearly every day since. Margaret, a document only protects the person who read it most carefully. Let's make sure that person is you. We started from the beginning. 2 weeks into our work together, Franklin called me on a Wednesday afternoon. He'd found something in the county property records he wanted me to see in person. He had a printout on his desk when I arrived, a public record from the county assessor's office. Someone had filed a request to assess the property for potential rezoning, dated 3 weeks after Warren's funeral. Filed under the name of a real estate holding company I'd never heard of. The company's registered agent was a law firm in Houston. I read it twice. Franklin didn't say anything. He just let me sit with it. What went through me in that moment wasn't anger exactly. It was something slower and more permanent than anger. It was the feeling of finally understanding the full shape of something I had been sensing for over a year. I don't know with certainty that Elliot was connected to that filing, but I understood, clearly and for the first time, that I could not afford to keep assuming the best. Franklin and I worked for 6 weeks. We updated the will. We tightened the property documents. We added a co-trustee provision. Ruth, who accepted without hesitation and with a steadiness that reminded me why she's been my anchor my whole life. "There's a real difference between paranoid and prepared," Franklin said at our last meeting. "And it matters which one you are. A woman who knows what she owns doesn't have to be afraid of what anyone else wants to do with it." The conversation I'd been bracing for came on a Saturday in February. Elliot and Patrice drove down together, which was unusual. They arrived with a casserole and a bag of pastries from a bakery in Houston I'd never heard of. People bring food when they need you to be in a good mood. We sat at the kitchen table, we ate, we talked about the grandchildren, about Elliot's firm, about a trip Patrice was planning. All pleasant, all surface. Then Elliot set down his fork and said, "Mom, we've been thinking about your situation." My situation, as if I were a problem that had been assigned coordinates. "Tell me," I said. He talked for about 10 minutes. The house was too big, he said. The upkeep was too much. At this stage of life was the phrase he kept using. They'd been researching senior living communities in Houston, had found one they really liked, had toured it twice already, and thought I should take a look. Toured it twice. Patrice slid a brochure across the table. Glossy, cheerful photographs of people playing cards and taking yoga classes. I picked it up. I looked at it. Then I set it down. "When did you tour it the first time?" I asked. Elliot glanced at Patrice. "Last fall. We didn't want to bring it up until we had something concrete." "Last fall?" I said. "That would have been around the time of my hip procedure." He nodded, not catching the weight of it. "Elliot," I said, "that was when Patrice was measuring my living room walls." The table shifted. Patrice set down her coffee cup. Elliot's expression went from prepared to uncertain. "I saw her," I said quietly. "I came out of my bedroom, and I watched her walk from window to window with a yellow legal pad. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Now I am." The kitchen was very still. Elliot said, "Mom, I didn't ask her to do that." "I believe you," I said, and I did. "But here's what I want you to understand. You toured a building for me before talking to me. Someone filed a rezoning assessment on this property 3 weeks after your father's funeral. You've been handling my future like a project. And all of it, every bit of it, happened without one conversation with me." I gave that a moment to land. Then I said, "I also want you to know that I've spent the last 6 weeks with Franklin Greer. We updated the will. We tightened the property documents. Ruth is now co-trustee on the house. Everything reflects what I want, not what works best for anyone else's plans." Elliot looked at his hands. Then he looked at Patrice. Then he looked back at me and didn't say anything for a long moment. "You will always be my son," I told him. "I love you completely. But I am not your project. I am not your situation. I am your mother, and I am capable of making every decision about my own life." He didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly, the way a person nods when something has finally arrived that they'd been putting off understanding for a long time. What followed wasn't dramatic. Real life rarely is, and I have never trusted stories that end with everything perfectly resolved. Elliot called me 2 days later. He said he'd only ever wanted to help, and I believed him. That has always been true, even when his version of help looked like something else entirely. We talked for a long time, a real conversation, the kind that costs something. He said, "I should have asked you, not assumed, not planned around you, asked." He meant it. I could tell. Patrice and I are not warm. We may never be warm. But at Easter dinner she asked about my garden, and she listened to the answer the way people listen when they're actually curious, not just waiting for their turn to speak. I thought, that is a start. It may be a small one, but it is real. Ruth comes over most Sunday afternoons now. We sit on the back porch in the late light, drink sweet tea, and argue about the books we've been reading. She watches the bird feed her the way she watches everything she loves, with a settled, unhurried attention, like she has all the time in the world and is glad of it. I should have been leaning on her years ago. I'm making up for lost time. The house is still mine. I repainted the living room in January, a warm sage green I'd been wanting for years, the kind of color you keep putting off because it's only for yourself. I hired a young man from down the street to fix the gutter properly. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, taught by a retired art teacher named Beverly, who says we have to produce 20 bad paintings before we earn a good one. I find that both deeply discouraging and completely freeing. I'm on painting number 11. Every Tuesday morning, I stand at my front window with my coffee. The November light comes through exactly the way it always has, the way it did when Warren stood in it for 46 years. I don't try to hold on to that light. I just let it be there. Some things don't need to be managed. They just need to be allowed. Before I go, I want to say one thing directly to you. If something in this story felt familiar, a child who started planning without asking, a family conversation that happened around you instead of with you, a moment where you realized your opinion had stopped being part of the equation, I need you to hear this. Your age is not permission, not for anyone, not your children, not the people who love you most, to step in front of your life and start making decisions about it without you. The most important conversation I had this year wasn't in Franklin's office. It was the one I had with myself, standing at my kitchen window with cold coffee in my hands, asking a question I hadn't asked in 4 years. What do I actually want? It took me 3 days to answer honestly. But when the answer came, it came the way true things do not, with fanfare. Just plain and clear, and a little embarrassing that it took so long to ask. Warren used to say I was the steadiest person he knew. I used to think steady meant unchanging. I know better now. Steady means you know where you stand. And you don't move, not for convenience, not for comfort, not for anyone who decided your chapter was finished before you'd written the last line. Thank you for being here with me today. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what this brought up for you.